This is the Late Round Podcast with your host, JJ Zachariason.
What's up, everyone? It's JJ Zachariason, the editor-in-chief at FanDuel and at NumberFire.com, and this is episode 277 of the Late Round Podcast, one of the many shows that are part of the FanDuel Podcast Network. Thanks for tuning in. Week 1 is now officially in the books, which means it's time to overreact about everything that we just saw. Clearly, Baker Mayfield is just hype. Clearly, the Packers' offense is trash. And clearly, my 13-month-old daughter could play defense for the Dolphins. That last one might be true. As I say each year, let's not overreact to what we just witnessed in week 1. Let's just react. Let's be logical. And the first step in doing that is to look at the greater fantasy football landscape to see who you should be buying, selling, and adding. Fortunately, that's what this podcast episode is all about. How convenient. Before we look at this week's 15 transactions, I wanted to send another reminder about this year's World Fantasy Football Championship. From now until December 1st, you can enter a number of different qualifiers at different price points to earn your seat at the $2.5 million live final in Puerto Rico or the $3.5 million online championship. For more info on the WFFC, visit fanduel.com/WFFC or download the app today. Eligibility restrictions apply. Hold David Montgomery and Miles Sanders. So I'm grouping these two rookie running backs together because their situations are kind of similar. Let's start with Montgomery. Montgomery had a 38.4% snap share in Chicago's Thursday night loss. He did outcarry Mike Davis 6-5, but that split is still pretty worrisome. And then all the while, according to Pro Football Focus, Tariq Cohen played 80% of his snaps from the slot, and he played just 4 snaps in the backfield. So what you have here is David Montgomery and Mike Davis in the backfield, and Tariq Cohen is all of a sudden a slot wideout. Now, as a result of that, you could argue that Mike Davis is now the only player in David Montgomery's path to getting more volume. But I do think that Tariq Cohen may have been playing in the slot more in this opening game because of Anthony Miller's ankle injury. Anthony Miller being the guy who's usually playing in the slot for Chicago. So all of a sudden, if Miller's healthy, that might push Tariq Cohen back into the backfield, and you have an even more worrisome situation for David Montgomery. And then on top of that, you do have to be a little bit concerned about Mike Davis's role on third down and as a pass catcher as well. David Montgomery can be a great pass catcher. His only catch in that game was actually awesome. But Davis saw 7 targets in that contest, and Montgomery had just 1. So this is one of those situations where you might see David Montgomery as easily the best talent in that backfield. I wouldn't really disagree with that. But Tariq Cohen's not going away, and I think that Mike Davis is one of those pieces where he might not have standalone value, but he's going to dig into Montgomery's workload. He's going to hurt David Montgomery more than he helps himself. So right now it's just tough to sell Montgomery given this performance, but I also wouldn't tell you to go buy him either, because this backfield honestly might just be a headache. Now, I would argue that Miles Sanders is in a little bit better of a situation. He played 48% of Philly's snaps against Washington, which is better than what David Montgomery had snap share-wise for Chicago. And Miles Sanders led that backfield with 11 carries. And then on top of that, Philadelphia just has a more dynamic offense than Chicago has. And I'm not just saying this because Chicago was horrible on Thursday night. I think we can look up and down the roster and see that Philadelphia has a better offense than Chicago does. And that's going to lead to more scoring opportunities. So I think with both players, though, you can't exactly sell them right now because of the probable return that you would get. But I also wouldn't invite these players onto my team because their backfield is a true mess. And in the end, coaches are making these decisions to have these split backfields. You might think a particular player is the most talented in a backfield, but his coaches might not. And that's what matters in fantasy football. So yes, they both still have a lot of upside. If things break their way, both Montgomery and Sanders could be really good players for your fantasy squad. But I'm just not buying into that right now. Add Marquise Brown. So if you talk to people on Twitter and you say Lamar Jackson had a great game, the comeback seems to be, well, they played the Dolphins defense and the Dolphins defense sucks. Yeah, the Dolphins defense might be bad, but we should also add that the Dolphins secondary is probably the best part of that defense, for what it's worth. And Marquise Brown destroyed that secondary. He only played 14 snaps on Sunday, and he had a 19.2% target share. And then obviously, he produced. He had 2 big touchdowns. And I think his snap share is going to rise. Baltimore didn't just throw him out there because he was dealing with a foot injury all offseason. And after what he did on Sunday, you have to feel optimistic that he's going to find the field more and more. And then guess what? Baltimore gets Arizona this week, who just got torched by Matthew Stafford in that Lions passing attack. So you've got to prioritize Hollywood Brown off the waiver wire this week, especially if you need a wide receiver. Buy Juju Smith-Schuster. Can Juju Smith-Schuster be a top receiver? That's what everyone's asking on Twitter now, because the Steelers only posted 3 points in New England, and it was the first game without Antonio Brown. But what I don't understand is why Juju isn't getting a pass when other top options going up against New England do. You remember the AFC Championship game? The Chiefs scored 31 points. Tyreek Hill caught 1 pass. DeAndre Hopkins, Week 1, 2018. He had a pretty comparable line as Juju did here in Week 1 this year. Devontae Adams last year, he only had 40 receiving yards against the Patriots. Keenan Allen in the playoffs, he had 2 receptions. I actually think that there's some positives that we can take away for Juju in this game. He did still have 78 receiving yards. And because the Steelers' secondary is just that bad, the Steelers could see some negative game scripts this year. Maybe their drop in pass attempts isn't as significant as we thought. They threw the ball 47 times. If they continue that pace in any way, shape, or form, Juju's going to walk into 160 targets this year. And then you have to look at Pittsburgh's upcoming schedule, because let's not forget, New England has a good secondary. It's a good defense. It's a tough matchup. But the Steelers get the Seahawks in Pittsburgh in Week 2, who just watched Andy Dalton throw for over 400 yards against them. And they'll follow that up with matchups against the 49ers and the Bengals. So I expect the Steelers offense to rebound after this bad Week 1 performance. And I would be buying Juju Smith-Schuster if any Juju manager is worried about this Week 1 performance. Sell or hold Ronald Jones. I do think that Ronald Jones was the most impressive running back for Tampa Bay in Week 1. But there are still issues with Jones as a receiver, at least how the coaching staff seems to be viewing that. As we know, he had a low final season reception share in college, and he struggled with pass protection during camp and in the preseason. And as a result, on Sunday, we saw Dare Ogunbowale see 5 targets to Ronald Jones' 1. And because the Buccaneers saw a negative game flow, Dare actually outsnapped Ronald Jones. There are Ronald Jones truthers out there. Some of you listening to this episode right now love you some Ronald Jones. I think if you can take this 88-yard performance and sell it, you should. Because Tampa Bay is probably going to see a lot of negative game scripts this year. And I'm not certain that Ronald Jones is going to be on the field when that happens. If you can't sell Ronald Jones for a usable piece right now, though, I would just hold him. Add Malcolm Brown. This was the fear. I talked about this a lot this offseason with how Todd Gurley's usage isn't going to be so clean cut. You can take 70% of what he did last season or what he's done under Sean McVay and say that he would still be an RB1. But what happens if Todd Gurley doesn't get goal line work? What happens is Week 1. Now, Gurley still looked pretty good, but it was very clear that Malcolm Brown had a clear role in this offense. He ran the ball 11 times versus Todd Gurley's 14 rush attempts. Brown did only play 27% of LA's snaps, though. Todd Gurley was at a 70.1% snap share. Now, during the regular season last year, Gurley hit that low of a snap rate only twice, and he carried the ball 15 or more times in 10 of his 14 games played. So what I'll say is, it does appear that LA is giving Todd Gurley a different workload compared to last year. I would be worried if I had Todd Gurley on my fantasy roster. But at the very least, right now, it does look like Malcolm Brown has some sort of role. I don't know how confident I would be playing him week in and week out, but he is flex-worthy. Add Mecole Hardman. So probably the biggest injury from Week 1 was Tyreek Hill. He's going to miss an extended period of time. That opens things up for Sammy Watkins. We already saw Sammy Watkins go absolutely nuts this week. But it should also open things up for rookie Mecole Hardman. In Sunday's game against Jacksonville, Hardman played 78% of the Chiefs' snaps and he ran 27 routes. Both of those numbers were second on the team behind only Sammy Watkins. So even though Hardman only saw 1 target, there should be opportunity in the future without Tyreek Hill in that lineup. Buy Brandon Cooks. So we didn't see a lot of good things from the LA passing attack in Week 1. But it does create a nice buying opportunity for the pieces in that offense, specifically Brandon Cooks, because he was the worst wide receiver of the 3 on that team this past week, at least from a production standpoint. But the thing is, last season when Cooks, Kupp, and Robert Woods played significant snaps together, Cooks led the team in targets. And take a look at the Rams' upcoming schedule. They really don't face a good defense until Chicago in mid-November. And then in between, they get the Saints, the Browns, the Falcons, and the Steelers. They could have some shootouts in there, and then they face some really bad defenses as well. So I think that right now is the time to be buying this Rams passing attack, specifically Brandon Cooks. Add Terry McLaurin. I wasn't very into Terry McLaurin when he was entering the draft, but he looked really impressive in Week 1. And he's in an offense without a lot of alternative pass catchers. So by default, Terry McLaurin should be targeted off the waiver wire this week. On Sunday, he was second on the team in snaps at wide receiver behind only Trey Quinn, and he ran just one fewer route than Quinn did. And only Chris Thompson ended up seeing more targets on that team. And Terry McLaurin is the deep ball threat on this roster. He had easily the highest average depth of target on the team on Sunday. It was over 20 yards. So I think that of the players in this offense, he's the ceiling play. He's the guy that you want to target off the waiver wire. Buy Mike Evans. So a lot of you are going to look at Jameis Winston's week 1 performance and want nothing to do with his Tampa Bay passing attack. I can understand that to a degree. But historically, there's been no correlation between interceptions thrown and plays run by an offense. Since fantasy football is a game about volume, that's good for Mike Evans. Now, Evans was targeted just 5 times against the 49ers, but he finished the day with 114 air yards. That's according to airyards.com. That was a top 20 mark in the NFL through Sunday night's game. We've seen a history with Mike Evans and Jameis Winston. We know that Jameis Winston can be inconsistent, and we know that Mike Evans can be really, really productive. So it was a down game for Mike Evans, and it just so happened to happen in week 1. But there are some underlying stats that show that Mike Evans should rebound as soon as next week. Add John Ross. So with AJ Green absent and not in the lineup, the Cincinnati wide receiver that stepped up was John Ross. He had everything going for him in week 1. The Bengals might have thrown the ball a lot, so he saw 12 targets, but it still accounted for 25% of the team's targets. Ross found the end zone twice, he had over 150 yards receiving, and he played the second most snaps on the team at wide receiver. I don't think that we should just sit back and assume that this is the year that John Ross is going to break out. But I don't think that we should just bury him after he's had 2 years in the league and he's been hurt throughout those 2 years. And not only that, but there's a new coaching regime in Cincinnati, and they seem to be competent. And with a few easy matchups over his next 4 games, John Ross could be a plug-and-play guy until AJ Green comes back. Hold Tyler Lockett and add DK Metcalf. So we were all hoping that Brian Schottenheimer would change his ways and let Russell Wilson just rip the ball down the field a little bit more in 2019. And what happened in week 1? In a game with a pretty neutral game script, Russell Wilson threw the ball a total of 20 times. Now that low volume is going to impact everyone on that team. Tyler Lockett, who had a 23% target share when Doug Baldwin was out last season, he had just 2 targets on Sunday. Now fortunately, it's Tyler Lockett, so of course he scored a 44-yard touchdown. But as efficient as he is, he's not going to be able to score a 44-yard touchdown on half of his targets this year. He's efficient, but he's not that efficient. And then all the while, DK Metcalf stepped in and he saw 6 of a possible 19 targets for Seattle. He might be rostered in your league, but as of Monday morning, he's on 64% of Yahoo waiver wires. Considering that target share, I would be adding DK Metcalf. But I do think that the target share pie should only grow as the season moves on, at least in the early parts of the season. And I talked about this last week. Seattle's upcoming schedule consists of games against the Steelers, Saints, Rams, Cardinals, and Browns. Each of those teams have offenses that could force Seattle to play catch-up. And that's especially true when you consider how bad Seattle's defense played in week 1. Sell Zach Ertz. You guys are probably so sick of me talking about Zach Ertz. This is probably the last time I will talk about him on the 15 Transaction Show, but sell Zach Ertz. Out of a possible 39 targets for Philadelphia in week 1, Zach Ertz saw 7. That's not a bad 18% target share, but it's not what Ertz saw last season. And that's what I've been trying to say. I think that Zach Ertz's 2019 is going to be more like his 2017 and not his 2018. Because when Golden Tate was added to the mix last year, we watched Zach Ertz's target share drop by roughly 7 percentage points. Now the Eagles have Deshaun Jackson, a healthy Alshon Jeffrey, and a more experienced Dallas Goedert. That's going to make it tough for Zach Ertz to see a lot of volume in this offense, or at least the volume that we expected him to see given his 2018 season. I think Ertz is fine. He's going to be a good tight end in fantasy football. But that position is fairly replaceable just given that you only need 1 in your starting lineup. And if you can get a worthwhile running back or wide receiver for him, I think that you do it right now. Hold Dante Pettis. So Dante Pettis played 2 snaps in San Francisco's win over Tampa Bay on Sunday. 2. For those of us who bought into Pettis when his average draft position dipped, I say us because I did that as well, this is not an ideal situation. But the reason I wanted to talk about him on today's show is because there's at least some reason for it, and I feel like people aren't digging into that reason. After the game, head coach Kyle Shanahan said that he, Pettis, had health issues, so that's why he missed a week of practice. He just got cleared to come back on Monday, so he was a little behind the 8 ball on that. He didn't start the game, and we didn't have a ton of long drives where we got into the substitution flow. From everything I saw, he did a hell of a job out there. On 2 snaps, really, Kyle? Hopefully, he continues to earn more time out there. The health issue, which was a calf problem, was at least part of the reason for Pettis' lack of involvement on Sunday. So instead of just flat out dropping your mid-round pick, just give Pettis a week or two and see what his role is going to look like in this offense. Add Josh Allen. The Bills are on the road this week, and they're 2-point favorites against the Giants. And as we saw on Sunday, the Giants have a poor defense that got destroyed by Dak Prescott and that awesome-looking Dallas Cowboys offense. So Josh Allen's in a plus matchup. And we know that Allen has some upside because of what he can do with his legs. He had 38 rushing yards on Sunday, and he's now rushed for 15-plus yards in each start with an average of roughly 54 rushing yards per game. That's basically an extra passing touchdown to his fantasy total each week. Despite his iffiness as a thrower, he has a high floor each week in fantasy football. I think he's this week's top streamer. Add the Carolina Panthers defense. So the Panthers are only rostered in 6% of Yahoo leagues because of their week 1 contest against the Rams. But in week 2 on Thursday night, they get Tampa Bay. Tampa Bay has a bad offensive line, and they have Jameis Winston. And Jameis Winston has averaged 1.4 interceptions per game dating back to the start of last season. So the Panthers this week are the top streaming defense. As for the 16th transaction that you can't get in the 15 transactions column over on numberfire.com, well, there are a ton of players you can add if they're available. You got TJ Hawkinson, who blew up in week 1 and looked awesome. Raheem Mostert, who I actually talked about on my mailbag show last week. Preston Williams, AJ Brown, Giovanni Bernard, if that Joe Mixon injury is worse than it looks. Jamison Crowder, if he's available, he's going to be a target machine. Keyshawn Johnson, Deebo Samuel, Mike Davis, Paris Campbell. There's a lot of guys you can add this week. But I'll give you another one, which is to sell Adam Thielen and Stephon Diggs. I don't want to overreact to the fact that Kirk Cousins just threw 10 times on Sunday. But this is also something that I had talked about a lot on this show all summer long. Offensive coordinator Kevin Stefanski wants to run the football. We saw how things shifted for Minnesota when he took over last year, where they dropped significantly in neutral script pass to rush attempt ratio. And the more run heavy they are, the less volume for Diggs and Thielen. Both of those players have plenty of name value if you want to trade them now rather than risking it for later. I think they'll still be productive, but there's a chance that they see a little more inconsistency this season, making them more lower-end wide receiver 2s in fantasy football. That's going to do it for today's show, though. Thanks to all of you for listening. If you've yet to subscribe to the Late Round Podcast, make sure you are pretty much anywhere podcasts can be found. You can also find me on Twitter at LateRoundQB. Thanks, everyone. I'll talk to you tomorrow with this week's 10 Trends episode.